So, hello everyone. Welcome to lecture 1 on the topic the living world. So, this is the very first lecture that we are going to study in biology for class 11. And in the living world, in this chapter, we are basically going to deal with the diversity of the living world. What are the properties of what are the characteristics when we call someone as living, and how these properties are different from what we called as non-living things. So what is the difference between the living world and the non-living world? What are the properties that make someone to be called as living? So we will learn about those properties in this lecture, and we will also get to know what is the diversity of this living world. As we all know, whenever we see around ourselves, we see many different organisms, many different things which are present in our surroundings. For example, if I'm standing in a garden, let's say, so there are many plants that are also different types, different varieties. Then we can also see different kinds of birds that are present on those plants. We can see many reptiles. We can see insects there. So there are varieties of animals, varieties of plants that are also present in our surrounding. So the diversity of the living world we will understand in this unit. And for today's session, in today's session, we will learn the properties of the living world, what are the characteristics of the living organisms, and then how these different organisms, we know that we have millions of animals and plants that exist on this earth that are being discovered, and there are many yet to be discovered. So how these organisms are being named so that there is no confusion. As we know, so for example, like even in a family, if there are two persons, they are named differently to avoid the confusion. So when we have millions of plants and animals that exist on this earth, so how to avoid the confusion? Suppose if we give the same or different name to those organisms. So we will learn about those things in today's session. So we know that there are variety of living organisms that never fail to captivate us, that never fails to get our attention, and the remarkable habitats that house these organisms may range from frigid mountain ranges. So they may be present in the Arctic, Antarctic regions as well, or they may be present in volcanic eruptions, and they are present in lush deciduous forests, expansive oceans. We know that there are varieties of animals that are present underwater. So some are present in the freshwater lakes, some are present in salt water, some are present in deserts, and some are present in hot springs. And therefore, we are like speechless, or we are awestruck always with the variety of the animals and the habitat in which they reside. Also, the interplay of ecological conflicts and cooperations within the population. So, ecology is basically the interaction of organisms within an area with each other and with the surrounding. So the interplay of ecological conflicts and cooperation within the population, among various populations in a community, and even the intricate molecular. So the interaction may be at the molecular level, where within a cell we see that inside a cell we know there is nucleus, cytoplasm. There are various molecules, protein molecules that are present. So inside the cells also there is molecular machinery that is working. So the interaction between those molecules, the interaction between the population, the interaction between the community, or the interaction at the ecological level actually lead to a fundamental question that what truly is life. Because the interaction is basically taking place between the living organisms. So what truly is life? So there may be a scientific answer to this, that what is life, and there may be a philosophical answer to this. But we will deal with the scientific aspect of what actually life is. So to understand what actually life is, in the scientific terms, we need to answer this question which I have mentioned here, that what is it that makes an organism living, or what is it that a non-living or inanimate thing does not have, which a living thing has. So basically, we want to understand that what is the difference between the living and the non-living organisms. So what is the what are the characteristics that make that allow us to say something living, and what are the characteristics that define something as non-living. So what are the defining characters of a living organism? We will study those characters one by one in today's session. So the first, so these are the various properties, or we can say the main characteristics of the living organisms. So the main characteristics of the living organisms include growth, reproduction, metabolism, cellular organization, and consciousness. So by saying that these are the main characteristics of living organisms, I mean to say that a living organism can be defined by the parameters like it should have a growth, it should reproduce, it should have the ability to perform the metabolic activities, it should have a cellular organization in which various cellular components are present where the metabolic activities might take place, and a living organism is conscious, means it has a sense of consciousness. So firstly, we will start with the growth as a parameter for living organisms. So we know that the living entities grow through increased mass and the augmentation of individuals or the cells. So living entities, we know that like even in our stages we have seen that suppose if I plant a seed, so that seed will grow into the sapling and then it will grow into a bigger plant. So we see that the living entities grow by increase in their mass or in the size, and this happens by the increase in the number of cells or the number of individuals. So in multicellular organisms, for example plants or humans, particularly the growth is achieved through cell division or increasing the cell count. So in our body, a process of cell division takes place where a single cell divides into the multiple cells, into two cells by various process of, like there are various processes of cell division. So basically in multicellular organism, through the process of cell division, growth is achieved by increasing the, by either performing the cell division or we can say increasing the cell count. For example, plant growth is continuous throughout their lifespan, whereas in animals, we have seen that the growth is limited to a particular age. For example, we have seen that up to a particular age, after that age, we see that our height stops growing. So, in plants, this is not the case. In plants, usually the growth is a continuous process till the life ends. While in case of animals, there are certain aspects where the growth stops after a certain age, while there are some body parts like for example nails that keeps on growing. Here as we see that these keeps on growing irrespective of the age, so they persist throughout the life. So the growth can be continuous or it can be limited up to our age, but there should be a visible growth in the organism by the increase in the number of cells or by increasing the mass. So observing growth in unicellular organism is feasible only through a microscope because unicellular organisms are difficult to be seen through a naked eyes. So usually they are visualized through the help of the microscope, and if we want to see the growth in the unicellular organisms, we usually have to observe it under the microscope. So we can count or we can simply count the number of cells by performing in vitro experiments. So in vitro experiments are the experiments that are performed in the test tubes or in the laboratory conditions. On the contrary, if we see, for example, someone might say that if we are saying that growth is just the increase in the number of cells. So someone might say that we have seen that suppose there is a heap of dust, heap of waste materials. If we keep on putting some external material to it, if we keep on accumulating more dust to it, so is that a growth? So should that be considered as growth? And if we are considering it as growth, then is dust a living material? Is waste material a living material? So what is the difference between the growth of the living and the growth of the non-living organism, non-living entities? So when we talk about the growth of the living organisms, we talk about the growth that is internal. So the cell division is taking place inside the body of the living organism, and that is reflecting as the growth of the organism as whole. But on the contrary, or on the other hand, if I talk about the growth of the non-living entities such as mountains or such as the sand dunes that grow in size, their growth is external. So as I mentioned that if I keep on accumulating the material, if I keep on collecting the dust and make a heap of that, the growth is external and it is not internal. That the same dust particle is not dividing itself into the two and then leading to the growth. It is the accumulation of another dust particle from the external source. So it involves the accumulation of material on their surfaces. So this is in actual sense cannot be defined as the growth but the accumulation of the materials. So the difference between the growth of the living organisms and the non-living entities is that the growth in living organisms is internal, whereas in case of non-living things, it is external. Also, we know that the dead organisms does not exhibit growth. Therefore, growth can be defined as one of the characteristics of the living organisms. So this was about the first parameter or the first defining character of the living organism, which is the growth. The next is the reproduction. So as I mentioned that living beings should reproduce. So by reproduction, we mean that it should be able to produce the offspring that is similar to their species, which is similar to their parents. So reproduction is a key characteristic of living organisms. It involves generating offsprings with traits that are similar to their parents. So reproduction is basically it is a very important and key characteristic of living organisms that happen only in living organisms. And the living organisms reproduce through different modes. It can be sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. We'll not discuss much about the sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction in this lecture because it is not basically on the process of reproduction or the modes of reproduction. Maybe we will discuss this in another lecture. But for today, we are just trying to understand that how reproduction is the characteristic of the living organisms. So there are different modes. As I mentioned, in multicellular organisms, usually in plants and animals, in most of the cases, it is sexual reproduction, which is predominant. While asexual reproduction is also prevalent in some of the cases. For example, if I talk about fungi, which is also a multicellular organism, the growth most of the times happen through the reproduction most of the times happen through the asexual reproduction. So the rapid spread through the production of millions of asexual spores leads to the asexual reproduction or the production of newer offspring in the fungus. Fragmentation in certain fungi, filamentous algae and protonema of mosses also leads to the reproduction. There are also different types of asexual reproduction. Yeast and hydra. In yeast and hydra, another mode of asexual reproduction is budding. So budding is the means of asexual reproduction that give rise to new organisms. Now there is another kind of reproduction in which is kind of regeneration of the fragmented body parts that leads to the growth of new organism. So there is an organism which is planaria, which is also known as flatworm. So it regenerates through the fragmented body parts, thus leading to the growth of the organisms. And if I talk about the unicellular organisms, so this was about the multicellular organisms where most of the cases it is the sexual reproduction that predominates, while in some cases, as I mentioned, sometimes asexual reproduction also exists. While in unicellular organism, if I talk about unicellular organisms like bacteria, algae, amoeba, they reproduce by increasing the cell numbers through the cell division. So we can say that in these animals, the growth is synonymous to the reproduction, right? Because we define growth also as the increase in the number of cells due by the process of cell division. And here we are defining the reproduction as well as the increase in the number of cells. So basically we can say that in unicellular organisms, the growth is synonymous with the reproduction. Now, someone might say that there are certain organisms that are living due to some other parameters, which are the living parameters that define the living organisms, but they are not able to reproduce. So some organisms there are certain exceptions to this reproduction parameter of the living organisms. For example, some organisms like mules, sterile worker bees, infertile human couples. So there are certain organisms that do not reproduce, or they do not have the ability to reproduce. Reproduction, therefore, cannot be an all-inclusive defining characteristic of living organisms. So reproduction cannot be considered as the sole all-inclusive defining character of living organism, because we know that there are certain exceptions to this where the organisms are not able to reproduce, but they are living. For example, mules, sterile worker bees, infertile human couples. We have seen that there are many humans that are infertile, not able to reproduce, but that does not mean that they are not living. So, therefore, it cannot be an all-inclusive defining character of living organisms. So, now we move to the next characteristic of living organism, which is metabolism. So, metabolism is the metabolic activities that are taking place inside the cells. So metabolism involves the catabolism and anabolism. So it is the breaking down of materials or the formation of new materials inside the cells. It is another defining feature of all the living entities, encompassing the collective anabolic, which is the constructive process, and the catabolic, which is the destructive reactions within the body. So metabolism is equal to anabolism plus catabolism. So whatever the constructive and destructive activities which are taking place inside the cells or within the body, all the reactions that are taking place inside the living organism, inside the cell of the living organism, is known as the metabolism. And these activities are known as metabolic activities. So it is a defining feature that happens in all the living entities, and it occurs in both unicellular and multicellular organisms. So as I mentioned, metabolism has essentially two stages, anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism, as I mentioned, is a constructive process. So it basically leads to the synthesis. So synthesizing the complex substances from the simple ones. For example, photosynthesis, where carbon dioxide, water molecules are used to produce the complex molecule glucose. While on the other hand, if we see respiration, so respiration is the breakdown of glucose molecule leading to the release of the carbon dioxide. So the breakdown of complex substances into the simpler ones is known as the catabolism. So the anabolism and catabolism are together known as metabolism. These metabolic activities can also be demonstrated outside the cell in the laboratory condition or outside the organism in cell-free system. So these in vitro reactions represent the living process, distinguishing them from the non-living entities. So metabolism emerges as an undeniable defining feature of all living organisms without any exception. So in the first line, as I mentioned, that it is a defining feature of all the living entities. So basically, metabolism emerges as an undeniable defining feature. So it is without any exception. It is taking place in all the living organisms. Even in those organisms where the growth is not, even in those organisms where the growth stops after a certain period of time, or even the organisms where the reproduction is absent, but the metabolism is the characteristic or the defining feature that is taking place in all the living organisms without any exception at all the times. The next is the cellular organization. So we know that cells are the basic fundamental units, fundamental blocks of all the living entities, be it plant, animal or humans. So they are the fundamental units of all the living organisms we know. So cells are the basic fundamental unit of life, as we mentioned. So cell types, like there are two types of organisms that can be classified based on the cellular types. So unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms. Unicellular organisms are the ones that comprise the single cell, while multicellular organisms comprises the millions of cells that leads to the formation of organisms. Now, the cell itself is consists of many components, and these are organized within the cell. So, cell contains protoplasm, which is the living matter, and cell organelles, which is situated within the cells. So, the protoplasm and the cell organelles together are present inside the cell. And these organelles carries out various activities at the cellular level, contributing to the diverse life process. For example, we know that even inside the cell, if I talk about DNA, RNA, proteins, there are many or components that are present inside the cell. If I talk about the cell organelles like mitochondria, which we all know is the powerhouse of the cell, leads to the synthesis of the ATP, provides energy to the cell. If I talk about lysozymes are present inside the cell, or lysosomes are the cell organelles which are present inside the cells, which are known as the societal bag of the cell that helps in the lysis of the components that are present in the cell wherever it is required. So, for a rough endoplasmic reticulum that helps in the formation of protein. So there are many cell organelles which are present inside the cell. All of them are performing their distinct function at the cellular level, and they contribute to the diverse life process by performing these functions. So we know, as I mentioned, that cells are essential units for life process in organisms. And protoplasm and cell organelles collectively drive the cellular activities. So the metabolic activities takes place in the protoplasm. So the protoplasm and cell organelles collectively drive the cellular activities. And recognizing the pivotal role of cells in the structure and function of living organisms underscores their significance as the basic unit of life. So basically, we can see that we understand that how cellular organization is present in the living organism. While on the other hand, if I compare it with the non-living entities, for example, suppose a table or a chair, there is no such living cells that are present. There is no such protoplasm that might be present, or the cell organelles where these metabolic activities are taking place, where there is synthesis of protein, synthesis of RNA, DNA taking place. So there are no such activities happening at the cellular level or even at the atomic or subatomic level inside in the non-living organisms. The next property is the consciousness. So one of the other defining property of the living organisms is the consciousness. All living organisms exhibit an exceptional ability to sense and respond to their environment. For example, if mistakenly I touch a hot beaker, I will immediately get a sense that the beaker is hot and I need to remove my finger from there, otherwise I'll get burnt. Otherwise it will get burnt. So this is an exceptional ability to sense and respond to the environment which is present in the living organisms. While if I keep a chair near a fire, obviously it will not move. It does not have that consciousness inside it present that if I'll move or if I'll not move, I will get burned. It does not have that consciousness. But obviously if I'm standing nearby to a place where, like suppose where there is fire all around, I'll try to move myself because I have that consciousness that if I do not move from this place, I may get burned. So this is the sense of ability that is present. This is the sense, or this is the ability to sense and respond to the environment, which is present in the living organisms, but not in the non-living ones. External factors. So we can respond to external factors. We can have chemical responses. So external factors like living organisms respond to external factors such as light, water, temperature. We know that there are certain plants that move in the direction of light or away from the direction of light depending on their nature. So living organisms respond to external factors such as light, water, temperature, pollutants, and interaction with other organisms. Light duration or photoperiod influences many seasonal plant and animal breeders. The light duration affects a lot in their photoperiod, or we can say photoperiodism, which affects a lot in many seasonal plants and animal breeders. So chemical responses are another kind of response that is present in most of the living organisms. So all living things respond to chemicals that enter their bodies, highlighting the dynamic interaction with their surroundings. So suppose if we take something like, so we take medicines, we take drugs, so our body responds accordingly to that. So whatever the medicines we are taking to treat some ailment or some disease, our body respond to that. So our body is responding to some chemicals. So all living things respond to chemicals that enter their bodies, highlighting the interaction with their surroundings. Human uniqueness. Humans, we know that they are highly intelligent. They are considered to be highly intelligent animals, and human possess a superior trait, which is self-consciousness. And this self-consciousness sets them apart from the other living organisms. This additional ability contributes to the complexity of defining the living state. These are the characteristics of the living organisms. Now, there are certain challenges in defining life. For example, defining the living state becomes more challenging for human beings because we know that there are certain situations. For example, if there is a person who is in coma, including the patients in a coma supported by machines that replace the hearts and the lungs, despite bodily functions being sustained, these individuals are actually brain dead with no self-consciousness. But are they living? Should they be considered as living or non-living? So obviously they are living. But if we go by the parameter of consciousness, since they do not have any self-consciousness, it becomes difficult in terms of humans to define them as living. So when it comes to the defining the living state of human beings, since they have an extra attribute of self-consciousness, it becomes even more difficult when we talk about the living state in case of human beings. So what we can conclude is that sensing and responding to the environment are universal characteristics of living organisms, and at the same time the complexity of self-consciousness that adds a unique dimension to humans pose challenges in defining life in certain situations, like for example the one as I mentioned that the person in the coma, it is difficult to define them as, if I consider self-consciousness as a dimension which is important to humans, it becomes difficult to define those organisms as living. So these are the various characteristics of the living organisms, starting from the growth, reproduction, consciousness, cellular organization, and metabolism. So we see that these are the characteristics of living things, and if I take these parameters into consideration and if I look around myself, I'll see that there is a huge diversity of living organism that is present in our vicinity. For example, there might be fish, bird, plants, animals, or there are different microbes that are present in our vicinity. There are reptiles that are present in our vicinity. So basically, there is a huge diversity of living world that exists in our surroundings. So these are few examples of the living things like human, dog, cat, animals, elephants, fish, plants, butterflies, etc. So we'll now deal with the diversity in the living world and what all exists in the living world, how many organisms are there that we know till now to be exist in the living world, and there are many yet to be discovered. So what is the term biodiversity? So the number of known and described species ranges from 1.7 to 1.8 million. So these are the number of known or species that have been described till now. So these are approximately 1.7 to 1.8 million. And this refers to the biodiversity. The name itself defines that the diversity in the living organisms. Bio means related to living. Diversity means the diversified. That the how much different species or different different organisms that exist. So this refers to the biodiversity or the number and types of organisms that exist on the earth. And as we explore new areas, and even if we explore the older ones, new organisms are continuously being identified and are being continuously added into this list. So we know that till now approximately 1.7 to 1.8 million organisms have been identified or known, but there are much more to be discovered yet, which have not been identified and are continuously being identified as we explore the new areas or as we exploring the older ones also. So now since we have so many number of living organisms, so many living organisms that are present, it is very important to name them, right? For example, even in our house also, if we have 5 members in a house, we call them by different names. So it is really important to name them. So the process of naming the living organisms such that a particular organism is known by the same name all over the world is known as the nomenclature. So this process is called as the nomenclature. Nomenclature is basically a process of naming living organisms such that organism is known by the same name all over the world to avoid any confusion irrespective of the languages which are spoken in any part of the world. So nomenclature is only possible when the organism is described correctly, because every organism, if we are saying that it is different from the other organism, we have to describe it correctly. What are the similarities? What are the differences of this organism from the other organism? What are the properties that makes it unique? What are the differences or what are the exclusive properties that are present only in this organism? So all these things need to be identified, and this process is called as identification. So identifying organism is important. So identification of organism, identifying it correctly as a distinct organism is important, and then naming it is known as the nomenclature. So these are two different processes which are nomenclature and identification. So we will deal with the nomenclature. Suppose I identified a new organism, how to give it a name and what are the different rules that are being reported in the literature to name a particular organism. So nomenclature is why we required a nomenclature. We required a nomenclature system. We required a universal nomenclature system so that a particular organism can be identified. The particular organism which has been identified with all the properties should be called by the same name throughout the world, irrespective of the languages, to avoid any confusion. Also, this will help so that no two organisms get this similar name by any chance. So that different organisms should have the completely different name so that there will be no confusion in the scientific communities regarding the identification of any organism. So to facilitate systematic study, scientists employ the procedures to assign a scientific name. So now we have some local names also. For example, in local name we called as mango. But this mango can be called something different in some other parts of the world. So scientific community needs a systematic system of where different organisms are assigned a particular scientific name, which is universally accepted and it is practiced among all the biologists. So there are different nomenclature like botanical nomenclature and zoological nomenclature. Botanical nomenclature is for the plants, as the name suggests, botanical, and zoological nomenclature is for the animals. So for plants, scientific names adhere to the principles which are outlined in International Code for Botanical Nomenclature, which is ICBN, and this system ensures consistency and clarity in plant nomenclature worldwide. So whatever if I discovered a plant, if I identify a plant, then I have to follow all the rules which are being mentioned in the International Code for Botanical Nomenclature to name that particular organism. Now, the zoological nomenclature is used by the animal taxonomists. We will learn who are taxonomists, what is taxonomy. We will learn all these terms in the next lecture. But for now, the ones who study about the different animals, who identify different animals, are known as animal taxonomists. And these animal taxonomists utilizes the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, ICZN, assign the scientific names to the animals. And ICZN establishes guidelines that maintain uniformity in animal taxonomy across the globe. So this basically helps in avoiding the confusion, any sort of confusion or any sort of misunderstanding in the name and in the identification of organisms, especially in the scientific community related to research. So basically, scientific names are the unique identifiers. This is a process of unique identification of every organism. And the description of organisms should enable people worldwide to arrive at the same name. So all the characteristics of the organism should be described in such a manner that if I from India is reading the characteristics of a particular organism and I am visualizing a particular organism, the other person who is sitting in any other part of the world who is also reading the same characteristics should also imagine the same organism. So the characteristics of an organism or the description of the organism should be in detail, and it should enable the people worldwide to arrive at the same name. So names are meticulously checked to ensure that they are exclusive to the organism. There is no other organism that exists by the same name in any part of the world. And establishing scientific names through international codes in botany and zoology ensures a standardized and unambiguous system for identifying the organisms, fostering consistency and clarity in scientific communication. So just like we have a unique ID, for example, we all have our Aadhaar cards which are unique to us. No two individuals residing in North India or South India may have the same Aadhaar card number. Every one of us have a unique ID. Every one of us have a unique Aadhaar card number. The same way, in the scientific community, if I talk about the plants and animals or microbes or any other organism, so all of these organisms are being identified by the different names, and these names are the unique identifier, or these names are unique to that particular organism, irrespective of the place where it is, irrespective of the places. So in scientific community, they have an unambiguous system for identifying the organism that helps in maintaining the consistency and clarity in the scientific communication. So what are the principles of binomial nomenclature? So scientific community has all the biologists basically adhere to the universally accepted principles when assigning the scientific names to known organisms. Suppose today I identify an organism and I have to name it, then I have to follow a certain rules and regulations to name that organism. And all the biologists universally have accepted the principles of binomial nomenclature, where the name of the organism should have the two parts. For example, even in our case, for example, my name is Akansha Garg. So I have two parts. One is my surname and one is the name which is given to me by my family or by my parents. So this is the binomial nomenclature which is also followed in the plants, animals, or any other organism. So each scientific name comprises the generic name and the other is a specific epithet. So generic name tells us about the genus of the organism from which it has originated. It has some other similar characteristics, while the specific epithet tells us about the species of that organism. This naming system was introduced by Carolus Linnaeus and is known as the binomial nomenclature. The key components of this naming system are the generic name and the specific epithet. So generic name represents the genus to which the organisms belong, while the specific epithet denotes the unique species within the genus. So these are the two main key components. Global adoption. So binomial nomenclature has been globally adopted and is practiced by the biologists worldwide. Its widespread acceptance is attributed to its simplicity and convenience in providing the unique identifier for each organism. So it is simple because it only involves two components. So basically it has been universally accepted, and with its two-component naming system serves as a universally embraced method in biology, streamlining the identification and communication of known organisms across the globe. For example, the scientific name of mango, which is a very common name, mango. The scientific name is Mangifera indica. In this name, Mangifera represents the genus. So the first part of this name represents the genus, while the second part of the name represents the species or a specific epithet. So Mangifera indica is the scientific name of the mango, which is found mainly in India. So it is named as Mangifera indica. And so this is the binomial nomenclature where there is a genus. The first part represents the genus. The second part represents the specific epithet or the species. It should be italics actually, due to the rules which we are going to study later in the binomial nomenclature. So the scientific name of mango is Mangifera indica. Now, there are certain rules of binomial nomenclature. So biological names are generally in Latin or written in italics. So basically, the language which biologists have adopted to give the scientific name to a particular organism is Latin. As one of the reasons can be that it is a very primitive language and it is not being used widely in the scientific community. So just so that it should be prevalent in the scientific community as well. So biologists have adopted this language, and the biological name should be written in italics. As I forgot to mention the Mangifera indica written here to be in italics, we need to mention the binomial nomenclatures in the italics, right? So they are Latinized or derived from Latin, irrespective of their origin, to avoid any sort of confusion. The first word in a biological name, as I mentioned, represents the genus, while the second component denotes the specific epithet. We will learn all about all these terms like genus, taxonomy in the next lecture. But for now, the first word in the biological name represents the genus. It's just like whatever we get as a surname from our parents, right? In the Western culture also, if we'll see, surname is considered as the first part of your name, right? So usually, if I follow the Western nomenclature of my name, it should be Garg Akansha. So the first part represents whatever I am getting from the family, my family, right? So if I am belonging to this family, my surname will be considered as first part. So similar is the case of genus and species. The first word in a biological name represents the genus, and the second component denotes the specific epithet. Both the words in a biological name, if I am using a pen and paper and I am when handwritten, so when I am writing the words, so when I am writing a scientific name, it should be separately underlined. Like I cannot underline Mangifera indica together. Mangifera should be underlined separately, indica should be underlined separately, and it should be always underlined if I am writing a scientific name. And if I am using a computer or if I'm printing some scientific name, it should be in italics to indicate their Latin origin. So it should always be underlined and it should always be italicized, whatever the situation permits. The first word denoting the genus starts with a capital letter. For example, if I look at the example of Mangifera indica, so the first word of the genus, which is the Mangifera, starts with a capital letter, while the specific epithet starts with a small letter. So the I, irrespective of whether it's a name of a country, whether it is related to name of some person, it should always be starts with the small letter if it is a specific epithet. So it can be illustrated with the example of Mangifera indica, where we can see that I have italicized this word, and the specific, it is a binomial nomenclature where the Mangifera is a genus and indica is a specific epithet. The first word of the genus starts with a capital letter, while the first letter of the specific epithet starts with a small letter. So this was about the rules of the binomial nomenclature. Also, in some cases, the name of the author appears after the specific epithet, that is at the end of the biological term, and is written in an abbreviated or short form. So, example, Mangifera indica Linnaeus. So, it indicates that Linnaeus first described this species. So, this can be written if we want to mention the name of the scientist also who has discovered or described the species. So, this can be used. So, this was all about the naming, the naming of the organisms, which is the nomenclature, and also the identification of the organisms. In the next section, we will learn about the classification of the organisms and what is the different taxonomical or different levels of classification. So basically, how two different organisms are being identified. For example, in plants also we have different organisms. Under animal system, under animal kingdom also we have different organisms. So what is basically a kingdom? What is a genus? What is a species? We will learn all this in the next lecture. So here are some practice questions as well for today's session. So the first is, what is the correct format for writing a species name in binomial nomenclature? So is it genus first, then species, species, genus, family, species, order, genus? So we know that in binomial nomenclature, the first part represents the genus, while the second part represents a specific epithet or species. So the correct answer of this question is option A, genus, species. As I mentioned, in binomial nomenclature, the correct format is to write the genus name followed by species name. The next question is, in the scientific name Homo sapiens, so if I see scientific name Homo sapiens, what does Homo represent? Is it a family? Is it an order, genus, or a species? So the correct answer is the Homo. As we know that in binomial nomenclature, the first part represents the genus of any organism. So Homo here represents the genus. Homo represents the genus in the binomial nomenclature, while the sapiens, as I mentioned, represents a specific epithet or the species. The next question is, which taxonomic category is represented by the first word in a scientific name? So again, the same thing in the binomial nomenclature, the first word represents the genus, while the second word represents a species. So the correct answer is option A, genus. So the first word in a scientific name represents the genus of any organism. Similarly, the second part of a scientific name, specific epithet, usually refers to what? So does it represent the habitat of the organism? Does it represent the distinctive feature? Does it represent the individual characteristic of the organism, or does it represent the general category of the organism? So we know that the species, at the species level, we talk about the distinctive feature. So the specific epithet often describes the organism's distinctive feature of an organism's characteristic or specific features. How are scientific names usually written? So basically, we know that the scientific names, if we see the rules of the binomial nomenclature, we understand that how the scientific names are written. So the options are whether they are written italicized or underlined, whether they are written in bold, whether they are written in all uppercase letters, or whether they are written in lowercase letters. So we know that whenever we have to write a scientific word, it should either be underlined if we are writing it on a paper, or it should be italicized to show their Latin origin. So basically, the scientific names, if we go by the binomial nomenclature system, it should be italicized or underlined. So they are typically written in italics or underlined to distinguish them from their common names. The next question is, what is the purpose of using binomial nomenclature in biological classification? So we know that the options are to confuse the scientist, to simplify communication and avoid ambiguity, to give organisms long and complicated names, or to reflect the common names of the organisms. So we know that what was the purpose of introducing this binomial nomenclature was that we want that this organism having the same characteristic should be recognized by the same name all over the world, by the same name in the complete scientific community. So basically, it is actually helping in simplifying the communication and avoiding any confusion or ambiguity between the various scientific people across the globe, so that the same organism with the same characteristics can be identified by the same binomial nomenclature name. So it provides a standardized way to name and identify the species, avoiding confusion and ambiguity. So this was all about the binomial nomenclature. What was the binomial nomenclature system? What are the rules? It is very important. If we are talking about the NEET examination, then it is very important to understand what are the rules of binomial nomenclature. They might ask by giving you 4 different types of name, and they might ask whether which one is the correct. So you must know that what are the rules of the binomial nomenclature. So the first word, so I'll just repeat the rules quickly to quickly summarize this. So biological name should be written in italics or should be underlined. It should have a Latin origin, and the first word represents the genus, the second word represents the species, which is the distinctive characteristics of the organism. And both the words when handwritten should be underlined separately, not together. This is very important. Should be underlined separately, and it should be printed either in italics or in the underlined form. And the first word, as I mentioned, denotes of the genus should be capitalized, while the second word, while the first word of the species or the specific epithet is always the small letter. So with this, I would like to end today's session about the binomial nomenclature system and naming and identification of the organisms, and also different characteristics of the living organisms that we study today. In the next session, we will took the diversity, and also we will see what are the different levels of the classification of the organisms, how the organisms are being classified at the different levels. With this, I would like to end today's session. Thank you for attending it.